Okay. Well, Henry asked me to look at the price regulation system for electricity and the planning system for electricity in 4 countries: Iran, Saudi Arabia, China and Taiwan. I presented on Iran and Saudi Arabia yesterday, and today I want to talk about China and Taiwan. In particular, I want to talk about how those systems relate to nuclear power. My starting point for this is that nuclear power has seldom, if ever, been the cheapest way for a utility to expand its generation. The economic case for nuclear power has always been based on hopelessly inaccurate forecasts of costs and a promise that experience will bring the costs of nuclear power down. Those assumptions might be sensible and acceptable for new technologies with just a few years of experience, but nuclear power has been around for 60 years, yet forecasts seem to be as inaccurate as ever. For example, in Britain in 2008, the British government told us that the cost of the Hinkley Point reactor would be £2 billion. The latest cost a year or so before we start building it is £10 billion. So forecasts don't seem to be getting any more accurate. Over its history, nuclear costs have only ever gone upwards, and there's no sign that that trend is going to reverse and costs are going to start to come down. So the question arises, well, how and why are utilities able to take decisions that in any normal business would put them out of business? And I think there are 3 explanations, and I want to focus particularly on the first one. And the first is that is a lack of financial responsibility falling on the utility. If things go wrong, the utility doesn't go out of business, in part because of weak regulation in monopoly markets, or where there are competitive electricity markets, nuclear plants are somehow insulated from the market. For example, in Britain, we're giving our nuclear plant a take-or-pay fixed price contract for 35 years, so it's completely outside the market. Second factor, sometimes related to the first, is availability of finance that doesn't reflect project risk. And particularly for such a capital-intensive technology, this is a massive distortion. If the cost of finance is far below what it ought to be if it was reflecting the project risk. And low-cost finance might be because either the vendor or the government receiving the nuclear plant is giving sovereign loan guarantees to the financial institutions lending money. Or in other cases, there might be very strong regulatory assurances that whatever costs are incurred can be passed through to consumers. In that case, banks will see nuclear investment as a very low risk, at least to them, because the risk will fall on consumers. The third option is military aspirations, and clearly, in some cases, civil facilities are used to like reprocessing plants or enrichment plants for the civil sector are also used for the military sector, or skills are built up. So again, the civil sector is cross-subsidizing the military sector. So let's turn to China. China's electricity industry structure is not necessarily what you would expect. The system is huge, much larger than the United States, 1650 gigawatts of capacity, about 2/3 of it mostly coal, about 20% hydro, 14% wind and solar, only 2% nuclear, which equates to about 3.5% of generation. And I think it's very hard to imagine that nuclear could account for more than about 10% of capacity. So nuclear power in some respects is a bit of a sideshow in China. There are 5 giant utilities, each with a 105 to 160 gigawatts of capacity each, and they own about half the capacity in China. They're much larger than the nuclear vendors, but these 5 giant utilities can only own minority stakes in nuclear power, and this may be one of the factors why they are not so enthusiastic about nuclear power. Most of the rest of the capacity is owned by provincial authorities. There are 3 reactor vendors: China General Nuclear, China National Nuclear Corporation, and the State Nuclear Power Technology Company. And unlike most utilities, these also own nuclear power plants, and they own other generation. They own renewable plants, they own coal-fired plants. There seems to be an ongoing process of rationalization in the sector, and a number of mergers are being proposed involving the big 5 utilities and the reactor vendors. The SNPTC is in the process of merging with the smallest of the big 5. There's clearly an increasing influence of the provinces through owning of generation, but also determining dispatch and determining prices paid. Demand growth in the last few years has fallen well below the 7% that was typical for the previous decade or more. So one of the main justifications for nuclear does seem to be falling away. Unlike the other 3 countries that we're looking at, nuclear is seen as part of the national import and export policy. It's part of the Belt and Road Initiative. But whilst the vendors, like most reactor vendors, have a long list of target markets which they claim they're about to sell reactors to, they prove very difficult to crack. And the only orders Chinese nuclear companies have are for Pakistan, and the Pakistan market goes back about 20 years. It's about 20 years ago that Pakistan ordered its first reactor from China. But there are no other firm orders, and there seem to be none likely in the next few years. Expansion in China was very rapid. Up to about 2008, there were about a dozen reactors ordered, but from 2008 to 2010, about 25 reactor constructions were started. All of these are now in service except for 6 imported reactors, the French EPR and the Westinghouse AP1000. And unlike most Chinese reactors, these have gone badly wrong. They're about 4 to 6 years late. None of them are in service yet, and they're still being delayed. Most of the reactors that China has are of a very old design dating back to the early 70s, and clearly not the right basis for future orders. And the hope with these imported reactors was that China would indigenize the designs as it did with other technologies, and it would do them cheaper and better than the companies licensing the technologies. But this has clearly gone wrong. The hope was that AP1000 would be the reactor for the future, and I think it's very close to being abandoned. The EPR has effectively been abandoned. As David said, since Fukushima, there have been relatively few construction starts, so about 2 a year since Fukushima, and there's been none since 2016. I think there are other factors at play than Fukushima in this pause in ordering. I think the failure of the imported reactors was hoped that most of the orders that would be placed would be for these new designs. There is an effective ban on building reactors on inland sites, and what this means is that the regions by the coast that can accommodate nuclear power already have enough nuclear power. There's probably a skills shortage arising from the very large number of orders placed from 2008 to 10. And there's also the lack of interest in nuclear power from the big five utilities. So China now seems to have switched to promoting its own indigenous designs. And the lead seems to be Hualong 1, which is offered by both China General Nuclear and China National Nuclear Corporation. SNPTC is trying to develop a scaled-up version of the Westinghouse AP1000, but that seems to be some way away from being available to order. There are suspicions of delays and high costs at Hualong 1. Nothing confirmed yet, but China is never quick to admit that there are problems with construction. In 2017 and this year, the Chinese government has forecast there would be 8 construction starts per year, but there have been none in 2017 and none so far in 2018. And I think this is largely down to the uncertainty about technology. The AP1000 is not available. Previous designs are too old. And there are issues about Hualong 1, and I think that the Chinese want to see more evidence that it's buildable at an affordable cost before they put their effort behind it. The nuclear vendors themselves are moving it away from nuclear. They're looking to sell and own renewable capacity as well as nuclear projects, so they're looking to diversify away. If we look at the price setting for electricity in China, the central government sets the price for the guaranteed nuclear output at about 6.3 US cents a kilowatt hour. And the guaranteed output level has in the past been about 7,000 hours, so about 80% of the year. So for 7,000 hours, the owner of a nuclear power plant would be paid 6.3 cents. But the provincial authorities are pushing down that guaranteed level to as low as 4,800 hours, and the additional output has to compete in provincial markets against marginal cost coal generation, and it's not able to do that very well. The provinces would also like to reduce the guaranteed price for nuclear. So what is happening now is that the nuclear plants are load following, and some are even having to shut down for periods of low demand because they simply cannot compete. And this is having a significant impact on the utilization factors of reactors, going down perhaps from 85% to perhaps 75%. If we move now to Taiwan, we have a much simpler structure. The sector is dominated by a classic state-owned, fully integrated monopoly utility, Taipower. There appears to be no independent price regulatory body yet. It may just be in the process of being created, but it doesn't yet exist. By 2016, about 75% of the capacity was fossil fuel and only 10% nuclear. About 20 years before, nuclear made up about 25%, but the nuclear construction stalled after the mid-85s, so as demand grew, the relative share of nuclear power has gone down. It's expected that about 20 gigawatts of new capacity would be built by 2026. Most of that would be renewables and the rest coal. There is 5.1 gigawatts of nuclear power in service, all of it ordered in the 1970s, the last completed in 1985. And there is the 2.7 gigawatt Lungmen nuclear power plant, which was under construction since 1998. It has now effectively been abandoned, and the components are being sold off, and the fuel is being sold. And the expectation is that nuclear will be phased out by 2025. There are about 10 countries around the world that have had phase-out policies, and most of those have not stuck to their original timetable of phase-out. but none of them has actually gone back to ordering nuclear power plants. So my expectation would be that the 2025 date will probably slip a little, but there's very little prospect of any new orders for nuclear power in Taiwan. In terms of finance, the operating reactors were ordered when finance wasn't an issue, but Longmen construction appears to have been repeatedly delayed because of lack of funds from central government. There were concerns in the past about weapons proliferation and military connections with the civil program, but there seem to be much fewer concerns now. So finally, turning to conclusions, I think China and Taiwan have several factors in common. I think the military connections are probably less important than they were seen to be in the past. The nuclear programs were driven by centralized authoritarian regimes, and they were based on rapid electricity demand growth, typically 7% demand growth per year. And it turns out that China is actually much less centralized than it is often seen as, and the provincial authorities are now having an increasing impact on the electricity sector. Independent and rigorous economic regulation of the electricity sector is largely absent, but again in China the provincial authorities are beginning to have a significant impact on the electricity sector by pushing down prices, by promoting electricity wholesale markets. Recent construction experience in China and Taiwan is very poor. The Taiwan program appears to have little future. As I said, the 2025 phase out may not be met, but I think it's just a question of postponing the end for nuclear rather than there being any likelihood of a comeback. I think the Chinese program is at a crisis point. Exports are not materializing. The technologies that they hoped would provide the basis for future orders have proved very problematic and disappointing. Nuclear can't play a major part in China's power needs, so if the costs are high and exports are difficult to win, will China just quietly reduce the priority from nuclear power and gently phase it out? Thank you.